Matthew Gore of Memphis, Tennessee. His topic will be Born in Revival, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. He is an historian, a journalist, and an author. He's best known for his book, The History of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Kentucky to 1988. It was written in 2000. He will be talking about exploring the birth of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church during the early 19th century, rooted in the fervor of the Great Revival, with a focus on the pivotal events at the Red River Meeting House. It examines how the denomination emerged as a response to spiritual and social needs on the American frontier, and how its unique circumstances led to an accidentally progressive approach, including early steps toward inclusivity in ministry and theology. Please welcome Matthew Gore.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. So that's what I said I was going to talk about. Okay, well, we probably will stay somewhere in that vicinity. This is that magnificent tome that she just mentioned, The History of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Kentucky. We published this in the year 2000. I had been engaged to write it in 1989 by the Joint Heritage Committee of two Cumberland Presbyterian presbyteries, that is, Cumberland and Covenant presbyteries. And the way that works is if you have a committee that is angry that their presbyteries have been taken away, or rather their synod has been taken away, well, just continue to meet and call yourself a combined presbyterial committee. Apparently that's tolerable, legal in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. At any rate, they hired me to write this book. My knowledge of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church when I wrote this was limited to really two Cumberland Presbyterian churches. The one in Glasgow, Kentucky, where I graduated from high school. Not that I ever set foot inside, but they had a great hill. And on those rare occasions when we got enough snow, we would go and slide down the hill by the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. So that's one. The other one was the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Bowling Green. I knew of that during college because the Bowling Green Cumberland Presbyterian Church has put on the most incredible light display for Christmas of any church I'd ever heard of. And then, it's another, before I ever set foot inside a Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Well, actually, there was one other. When I was in college, we needed tables and chairs for an event for a student group. We borrowed them from a Cumberland Presbyterian church. My friend and I went and picked up the tables and chairs. The Cumberland Presbyterians in the room will get this. His name was Jim Woosley. And we went to Mount Carmel, Cumberland Presbyterian Church, to pick up the chairs and tables. That didn't mean anything to me. And then I met my wife. And apparently there's a thing in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, I think it's each one, marry one, or something to that effect. I didn't realize I was part of a church growth project at the time. But apparently I was. And I joined the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Bowling Green, which is where I consider my home church to be. And I'm very pleased to be here. This is not the first time I've ever set foot on this site. I've been here many times before. And it's a beautiful place. And there is something about it, as there is about the Cumberland Presbyterian birthplace near Dixon, Tennessee. There's just something about these places. My topic is how the Cumberland Presbyterian Church came out of the Great Revival. And I've said to several people already, I really wrote this for a non-Cumberland audience. And it intimidates me a little bit that there are several Cumberland Presbyterians here because they're the ones who are more likely to contradict me. But, having said that, let me launch. When we gather here at Red River, on ground made holy by memory and hope, We're not just recalling an event. We are standing inside a story that remade the frontier. The Great Revival of 1800 wasn't a single meeting or a flash of emotion. It was the beginning of a people. Even we Cumberland Presbyterians often speak of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church as if it were planned, as if some committee sat down and decided the world needed one more denomination. And as Presbyterians, we know you can do anything with a committee. But the truth is, as I've often said, that it was an accident of faith, born of need, tempered by geography, and sustained by a stubborn insistence that God's grace ought to be as broad as the rivers that carried the revival through Kentucky and Tennessee. The story begins, as so many frontier stories do, with a river. Actually, with several of them. The Cumberland, the Red, the Gasper, the Muddy, the Green, and the Barren. These were not just bodies of water. They were the lifelines of an emerging people. Settlers built their cabins along these streams, baptized their children in them, and carried news, goods, and gospel from one congregation to another by canoe, flatboat, or even by a muddy road that followed the watercourse. If you study a map of early Kentucky religion, you'll notice the revivals clustered not around towns, but along these waterways, the arteries of movement. The canalized rivers of Kentucky, a study done years later, reminds us how every bend and shoal connected communities that would have otherwise been isolated. It is no accident that the first stirrings of the Great Revival occurred along the Red River and spread through the Gasper and Muddy. These rivers were the means by which grace flowed into the wilderness. By 1800, America's frontier was a spiritual frontier too. The people who lived here were not godless, but they were tired. Tired from carving thorns out of the forest, tired from defending themselves, tired from a religion that seemed distant and from the hard realities of their lives. Churches were scarce, and ministers even more so. Presbyterians who valued education and order simply did not have enough clergy to keep up with the demand. The Methodists and Baptists, with their circuit riders and camp meetings, filled the vacuum. Then came James McGrady, the son of thunder, a Presbyterian minister with the fire of a revivalist and the persistence of a man who believed that God could still reach across the rough edges of the frontier. McGrady's congregations along the Red, the Gasper, and the Muddy Rivers prayed for revival every Saturday night and Sunday morning and all day on the third Sunday of each month. They prayed for Pentecost to come to Kentucky, and somehow it did. What began as small sacramental gatherings turned into scenes of holy chaos. Men and women wept, shouted, fell to the ground, barked like dogs, sang without tune or pitch, much as I do. They found in that fervor something the frontier had taken from them: connection, belonging, and forgiveness. And from those meetings along the rivers, the fire spread. By 1801, Barton W. Stone had carried the revival east to Cane Ridge, where tens of thousands came. But it was here, in Logan County, that it all began. It is fair to say that without Logan County, there might have been no great revival at all, and certainly no Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Presbyterians, the frozen chosen, sometimes called the Republican Party at prayer, didn't quite know what to do with all that emotion. McGrady's preaching and the enthusiasm that followed it challenged the formalism of the church. Soon enough, tension grew between those who wanted a more accessible gospel and those who clung to the strict demands of the Westminster Confession. At the heart of the dispute were questions as old as Calvin himself. Who can be saved? How educated must a minister be to preach? And who decides what is essential and necessary in the faith? The revival ministers, men like Finis Ewing, Samuel King, and Samuel McAdoo, weren't out to start a new denomination. They were simply trying to meet the spiritual needs of their people. They were practical men, and they knew that waiting for classically trained ministers from the East wasn't going to save a single soul in Kentucky or Tennessee. So, with the blessing of Transylvania Presbytery, they began licensing what many called uneducated men, men of good character and evident calling, to exhort and catechize. That decision scandalized some in the church hierarchy, and the Synod of Kentucky soon intervened. What followed was a slow-motion collision between revival energy and ecclesiastical order. When the Synod dissolved the old Cumberland Presbytery and demanded that its ministers submit to re-examination, the revivalists refused. They believed that God's call was higher than the Synod's permission. And so, in 1810, three men, Ewing, King, and McAdoo, met in a log house near Dixon, Tennessee, and without realizing it or intending to, founded a new denomination. This is one of the reasons I like to call the Cumberland Presbyterian Church accidentally progressive. The founders did not set out to create something new. They simply refused to let the old structure stop them from preaching grace. They were stubborn, but it was a practical stubbornness born of necessity. When the original Cumberland Presbytery reconstituted itself in 1810, it declared that education was important, but not always essential. That a man's call, his fruits, and his situation might matter more than his mastery of Latin or Greek. They were far from anti-intellectual, nor were they uneducated. Although many of their detractors insisted that they were. But they were anti-elitist, and that distinction matters. The same attitude has shaped the Cumberland Presbyterian Church ever since. We have rarely led revolutions, but we've stumbled into progress by doing what seemed right at the moment. When Louisa Woosley became the first woman ordained in the Reformed tradition, she didn't do it to make a point about gender. She did it because part of her church, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, saw no practical reason why she shouldn't. Theologically, we caught up with where our common sense had already been. Historically, this has been the Cumberland way. We don't chase trends. We live faithfully until someone notices we've done something historic. The early years were hard. The presbyteries that sprang from those early meetings, Logan, Cumberland, and Elk, were born into a world of earthquake and war. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 literally shook Kentucky to the ground. The War of 1812 took young men from their farms and from pulpits alike. Finis Ewing himself served as a chaplain soldier, preaching with his rifle across his saddle. The records of those days tell of presbyteries meeting in cabins, barns, under trees. Ministers rode seemingly endless circuits across creeks, through mud, from Red River to Gasper River, from Pilot Knob to Mount Moriah, preaching where they could, forming societies where they couldn't. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church was not built in cities. For decades, it avoided the larger towns altogether, preferring the hamlets, the clearings, the places without a steeple. We were quite literally a people of the frontier, poor in resources but rich in zeal. At the first meeting of Logan Presbytery in 1813, the ministers divided the territory into two missionary districts, east and west of the Cumberland River. That tells you something about how they saw themselves, not as bureaucrats, but as missionaries. They called their circuit riders missionaries, and they expected them to form new congregations wherever they went. Every river, every creek became a line of connection. Gasper River, where the revival had burned so hot, was still a center of activity. The Red River congregation was represented, as were those along the Muddy and the Green. From these waters rose not just congregations, but communities, schools, meeting houses, a new sense of who the frontier people were and who they could be. If you read the old Presbytery minutes, you can almost hear the weariness in their ink. Endless examinations of candidates, constant pleas for more preachers, and repeated reports of congregations vacant, but still meeting in hope. Yet there is also a steady optimism, a sense that God was doing something bigger than they understood. And indeed, He was. When we look back on those days, we see the makings of a distinctly Cumberland identity, not defined by doctrinal rebellion, but by an insistence that grace must meet people where they are. In a sense, that's what makes the Cumberland Presbyterian story so American. It's democratic, improvisational, self-correcting. The church didn't spring from ideology, but from experience. The lived faith of ordinary people along the Red, the Muddy, the Gasper, the Green, the Barren, and the Cumberland. Even our structures, presbyteries, synods, assemblies, mirror the balance of freedom and order. No bishop, no autocrat, but councils of equals trying to listen together for God's direction. That kind of polity works best for people who are used to rivers. People who understand that water must find its own level, that sometimes the Spirit flows around obstacles rather than over them. When the Great Revival erupted out here at Red River in 1800, no one could have predicted its reach. It started as a sacramental service and became a spiritual movement. It began with Presbyterians, but soon embraced Methodists, Baptists, seekers of all kinds. It broke barriers of education, class, and gender long before anyone thought about these topics enough to write them down. It's fashionable now to think of the revival in sociological terms, as a reaction to frontier isolation or post-revolutionary anxiety. But those explanations miss the heart of it. What happened here was theological. It was an encounter with God who refused to stay confined to categories imposed by the church. The revival said that salvation was possible for all, that emotion was not the enemy of reason, and that faith could thrive outside the polished pews of the East. It was messy, loud, and unrefined, but it was alive. And its noise and confusion enabled people to find the quiet assurance of grace. That same tension between order and freedom, intellect and emotion, formality and immediacy, has followed the Cumberland Presbyterian Church ever since. We have argued over education, over theology, over social issues, over whether to change the light bulb. We've sometimes erred on both sides, but underneath it all runs the same current of practical faith, flowing like the rivers that birthed us. We were and remain a people who believe that God calls ordinary men and women to do extraordinary work. Sometimes despite the structures that claim to speak for God. We are a church born of compromise and conviction, of accident and providence. When I call us accidentally progressive, I mean that we move forward not by ideology, but by obedience. We didn't set out to ordain a black man. We recognized a call. We didn't set out to ordain a woman. We recognized a call. We didn't plan to become ecumenical. We simply welcomed whoever came. We didn't intend to start a denomination. We just kept preaching when others told us to stop. That is our legacy. That's our challenge, to keep listening, to keep following the flow of grace wherever it leads, even when it takes us through muddy water. So when we celebrate the great revival here at Red River, we're not just remembering the old story, we're reaffirming who we are. We are the heirs of those who prayed beside these creeks, these rivers, who built churches from logs and hope, who believed that God's Spirit could move just as powerfully in a field in Logan County as in any cathedral. The great revival made a people, not perfect, not always right, but willing to be used. A people shaped by the land, by the rivers, and by the stubborn grace of God. And that, I think, is who we still are. Thank you.